Press that button.
Hi everybody and welcome to the CERIAS seminar here at Purdue University. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Loukas Lazos from University of Arizona. Since I see so many students here, I think it's worth mentioning that I met Loukas when he was a student, and he's now a faculty at University of Arizona, has been there for a while. And today he's going to talk about one of his research projects that is focused on jamming in wireless networks.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you for the invitation to come here and give this talk. It is a great pleasure to be here and talk to you guys today. So the title of my talk is Jam Me If You Can, Mitigating the Impact of Inside Jammers. And this is joint work with my PhD students, Alejandro Proaño and Cici Liu, and also it's joint work with Professor Marwan Cruz at the University of Arizona. Let's start by introducing the problem of jamming. So first of all, we need to define in the broad sense what is jamming in wireless communications. And given two communicating nodes A and B, one can define jamming simply as a deliberate interference that corrupts the transmitted signal at the receiver side beyond recovery. So because of the open nature of the wireless communications, this is a fairly easy attack to deploy. Anyone with a transceiver can actually interfere with an ongoing communication. So looking at the typical adversary model that has been considered for jamming attacks, one can see these attacks from an external adversary perspective. So a very simplified interpretation of the jamming problem is that an external adversary to this communicating system is trying to corrupt digitally modulated signals beyond recovery by inducing this deliberate interference that would reduce the signal to noise plus jamming ratio below a particular threshold. So the goal of the adversary to inject the signal such that the digitally modulated symbols cannot be recovered. So in this adversary model, the adversary is actually agnostic to the overall implementation of the network. He may know the specifics of the physical layer, but it's not necessary that he's aware of anything else that is going on in the network. Typical anti-jamming techniques that have been proposed for a long time in the literature try to dramatically increase the effort that the jammer must do in order to be able to launch this type of attacks. For example, if you consider spectrum systems, what is happening is you actually spread the signal over a large bandwidth such that the adversary now, if he wants to deny the communication, he must equally spread his interfering signal over this large bandwidth, and therefore he has to expend a lot of energy. So, however, in these type of anti-jamming techniques, jamming is still possible if the adversary has sufficient amount of power. Not all wireless systems actually do have sufficient bandwidth such that the signal can be spread over a large bandwidth. And then also, the success of this anti-jamming method typically relies on the secrecy of certain PN sequences, some pseudo-noise sequences, some secret information that is known between communicating parties. However, what happens when actually these PN sequences get compromised? So this is something that we will actually address today. So revisiting this adversary model that has been standard in dealing with the jamming in wireless communications, we now ask the question, what if the adversary is an insider? And this is a very realistic threat on many new wireless scenarios. For example, if you have a mobile devices, these are fairly easy to compromise. You can consider sensors. It's very realistic in ad hoc networks. Well, two things you can infer. First of all, these devices are easy to compromise. And second, these type of networks significantly rely on broadcasting. So, for example, if you consider either infrastructure-based or infrastructureless networks, a lot of the network operations happen using broadcast. For example, if I have this particular cell phone scenario, then a lot of the information such as broadcast, paging, synchronization, cell broadcastings broadcasting happens in a common frequency band that everybody is aware of. If you consider an ad hoc network scenario, bootstrapping of the network, neighbor discovery, channel access, routing, all of those operations employ broadcast. So the caveat of broadcast is that you must be able to share information to receive broadcast. So for example, now we consider a new adversary model in which the jammer is an insider. Because you have device compromise, you can assume that this insider can actually share information with the jamming device, and it's no longer an external entity, but is an entity inside the network. So the adversary's goal here is to launch a denial of service attack on the network functions. But at the same time, we consider that the adversary wants to remain subtle. So he wants to do his attack in such a way that he remains undetected. At the same time, as I said, the adversary is an insider. Therefore, he has access to commonly shared quantities such as cryptographic keys or commonly shared PN sequences. He's aware of the implementations of the protocols that he used to implement the different network functionalities. So he knows how exactly you're sharing access to the common wireless medium, how do you do your routing, what kind of protocol you use at the transport layer. He may also be aware of the network topology, so he may strategically place the jammers. And at the same time, he may be equipped with advanced hardware such that he can have multiple radios, he can have multiple antennas, and advanced computational power. And at the same time, because we want the adversary to remain stealthy, we also assume that he's selective. So selectivity can manifest in many different ways. For example, he can be selective in which packets he targets. For example, he can target high importance messages such as control packets, or he can even focus his efforts on a particular frequency band that implements, for example, the control channel. So because he tries to be stealthy, he also selective. So we will explore these different types of selectivity, see what their impact is, and see how they can be prevented. So let's first look at message selectivity. So here, the idea is the adversary wants to classify packets and be able to select which packets to jam. So for example, and this can happen in many different ways. For example, here, one way to do that, if you have a communication between two nodes A and B, the adversary may be sitting somewhere where he eavesdrops on this particular communication. He listens to the header of that packet, intercepts the header of that packet, can classify and understand what kind of packet it is. And then while this packet is on transit, by performing this real-time packet classification, he can decide, I can induce noise now for 3 symbols or 4 symbols or 5 symbols, and then drop that particular packet. So this is one method that he can exercise its message selectivity. A second method is use protocol semantics. If you know what are the specific operations of a particular protocol that is being executed, you can anticipate the transmission of a message. For example, the exchange of RTS and CTS messages at the MAC layer is very specified in time. Or if you have a multi-hop network scenario, you can intercept one packet at one link and anticipate that the same packet will be forwarded at another link. Therefore, by receiving the packet at one link, you can anticipate the message at the other link and then jam it. So you have multiple ways by which you can actually perform this classification so you can exercise your selectivity. We will focus on the first type of classification, real-time packet classification, see how it can be realized and also how it can be prevented. So what is the impact of this message selectivity on the network performance? Well, the adversary now has the luxury to perform different types of attacks while in reality he remains active for a very short period of time. For example, consider a route discovery protocol in a in an ad hoc network. Route discovery happens by flooding route request messages and unicasting back a route reply message. So in this particular type of attack, the adversary is actually dropping the route request on the shortest path from the source, which is node A here, to the destination, which is node D. Therefore, a longer and less efficient route is being discovered. Here you can see that in order to perform this type of attack, it may be sufficient to just drop a single packet. Or the adversary can focus his energy on the route reply and by dropping a single route reply message, which is essentially unicosted back to the source, he can prevent the discovery of a route overall or delay by a significant amount the route discovery process. So you can see by having this inside knowledge of how things work, he can actually be much more efficient in the way that he performs these attacks. We can also look at attacks at the transport layer. For example, if I have an end-to-end connection and I employ TCP to perform the transmission control on an end-to-end basis, the adversary may choose to drop particular TCP acknowledgement messages such that you have repeated timeouts at the receiver, therefore dropping the rate of communication to a significant degree. So we can talk about many different protocols that are implemented in this way, and we can construct many different adversarial strategies that have a very high impact on the network. And you can see here one of the artifacts of these types of attacks is that they're not constrained within the jamming range of the jammer, that they can propagate beyond the jamming rates and affect the network to a larger degree. So we have actually performed certain experiments to quantify what is the impact of this type of selective jamming attacks. Here we have a very simple line topology where we set up an end-to-end TCP connection between nodes A and E, and we had a selective jammer sitting between B and C on the link B and C, and then we implemented different selective jamming strategies. The x-axis denotes the jamming probability. So when you have a jamming probability, let's say of 0.5, that means that the adversary dropped 50% of the packets that it observed from the particular packet type. So we focused on TCP acknowledgements, RTS and CTS messages, only data packets, and then just random jamming. And you can see what is the impact of the different types of selective strategies on the throughput of the end-to-end connection. And this figure does not tell the truth entirely, because as you can observe, a random jamming strategy gives you better results compared to only targeting data or only targeting TCP acknowledgements. But in reality, when you randomly jam 40% of the packet, you actually jam a much larger volume of packets. So it's not normalized for the same jamming efforts. What is most interesting to observe here is the amount of time that the adversary has to remain active in order to launch these type of attacks. So here on the x-axis again, I have the jamming probability, the percentage of packets that are being dropped from each category. On the y-axis, I have the normalized effort of the adversary in terms of the time that it remains active compared to a continuous jammer. So for example, if I TCP connection lasted for 20 seconds, and then I have a normalized time of 10 to the minus 6, that means that the adversary remained active for 10 to the minus 6 times 20 seconds during these TCP connections. And as you can see, although random jamming has the highest effect, also it has the least efficiency in terms of the amount of time that the adversary remains active. On the other hand, attacks such as dropping TCP acknowledgements or RTS and CTS messages are very efficient in dropping the throughput. At the same time, they're very stealthy. The adversary practically is most of the time silent. That means that it saves a lot of energy, and at the same time is much harder to detect and much harder to localize. So this selective jamming is actually a real threat. So let's look at now that we established the fact that selective jamming can actually significantly impact our network performance, let's see how it can actually be realized. So to perform real-time packet classification, the simple strategy would be decode the symbols that you receive. Does the symbol that you decoded allow you to classify the packet? If it does, make a decision whether you should drop it or not. If not, decode the next symbol. And as you can see, it may be sufficient to decode very few symbols in order to be able to classify a packet. I know there's a lot of information in this slide and actually in the next slide, but basically by receiving the first few bytes of a MAC header, you can basically classify whether this is data packet, it's an RTS message, a CTS message. You can actually classify it at the MAC layer. Even going further, let's assume that we have a full packet that denotes the headers from the physical layer all the way to the TCP layer. I can perform classification at different levels. For example, by just receiving the type and subtype of the MAC header, I can tell whether this is a data packet or an acknowledgement or an RTS or CTS message. By receiving the MAC address, I can tell what is the originating transmitting node, what is the receiving node on a link-by-link basis. By receiving the end-to-end source and destination addresses at the IP layer, I'm able to identify the end-to-end source and destination. By looking at the ports, I can maybe identify the application that is running between this end-to-end session. So there are a lot of different classifications that can happen at different layers that will give you information for different types of selective strategies. So your success, the rate by which you can actually perform this real-time packet classification depends on the physical layer implementation. So if you get a very high-level schematic of a digital communication system, you can actually, the rate of information that you're getting depends on how you do channel encoding, how you do interleaving, how you modulate, what is the model that you have on your wireless channel, and then how do you do all the reverse operations. So now that we have established that you can actually do real packet classification by just looking at the header of the packet and even just decoding the first few symbols, let's look at methods for preventing this selectivity on behalf of the jammer. So if I have a packet and I need to conceal it, what comes to mind is, what's the easiest thing to do? I can just encrypt it, right? So for example, if you have two nodes A and B, and then you want to encrypt that information, you just apply encryption on the entire header and the packet together, and maybe you say that that's sufficient to hide the information from a jammer that is overhearing the packet while it's being transmitted. However, remember that we have said a lot of operations happen in broadcast mode. So a lot of network functions rely on this broadcasting operation. In that case, if you have to do broadcast, the key that you use for the encryption must be shared by multiple entities. If one of them is compromised, if a single node is compromised, then this commonly shared key is also compromised. So if you cannot assume that this key is safe, then simple encryption will not do. If I have the decryption key, because of the block-by-block nature of symmetric encryption, for example, I can start decoding different blocks as I receive the information, as I receive the ciphertext, and therefore still be able to classify a packet even if it is encrypted. So we have to be a little bit more careful in the way that we actually apply this idea of encryption. So what we did is basically we mapped this problem, it naturally maps to a commitment scheme. A commitment scheme is a scheme that is running between two entities, a committer and a verifier. And basically the committer can actually conceal a value M that is being transmitted to the verifier for a given period of time. And then later in the future, it can release some information that would allow the verifier to be able to read the value M. So for example, here, the committer sends a committed value C to the verifier. The verifier stores that value at a later stage. The committer will actually reveal additional information, for example, a message T that would allow the verifier to basically open the commitment and read the committed value. So here we sort of have an equivalent situation. What we want to do is we want to transmit a message. We want the receiver to receive that message. And at the later stage, we want the receiver to be able to open that message because this is a useful message. So the committer in our case is the sender of the information, and then the verifier is any receiver within the communication range of the sender, including the jammer. So what we want to have is the committed value is our transmitted packet. So we want to transmit the packet, we want this packet to be received. At a later stage, we want to release some extra information that would allow us to actually read the packet. Therefore, the jammer does not have the opportunity to classify the packet while it is in transit, therefore he cannot apply selectivity. So we propose a strong hiding commitment scheme, and here we only care about the hiding property of the commitment scheme. We don't care about the binding property of the commitment scheme, because we assume that the purpose of the sender is actually to communicate that message and is not to actually change that message when it has been communicated. So what this does is basically the sender generates a random key, and then he uses that random key to encrypt the packet, and then the encrypted packet becomes the commitment that is being sent to the receiver. And then at a later stage, the key that is being used for the encryption, the random key that is being used for the encryption of the packet, is actually revealed to the adversary. And that way, while reading C, one cannot classify what the plaintext is, and after receiving D, everyone can actually read the packet, including the jammer. But at that point, it's too late to jam the packet. The subtle point here is that the parser release of the decommitment value, the parser release of the key that is propagated from the sender to the receiver, must happen in such a way that it does not lead to the classification of the packet that has already been transmitted. So if I had a method by which I send first C, which is the encrypted packet, and then while D is being released, I can still classify C, then I can choose to jam D and then overall deny the communication. So we must be a little bit careful of how we set up this particular system to ensure that even the parser release of the decommitment value will not lead to the classification of the original packet that was transmitted, because we still have the opportunity to jam the decommitment value. So the way we actually set up this hiding this commitment scheme is by introducing a layer between the MAC layer and the physical layer, which is we call as the hiding sublayer. So this hiding sublayer performs the following functions. Assume that you have a MAC layer packet M. The first thing that happens is that the packet is actually permuted by applying permutation P1. I will explain exactly what this particular permutation is. The purpose of this permutation is basically to randomize your plaintext before you encrypt it. Then you encrypt the plaintext with the random key, and then you generate the ciphertext. Then you pad the ciphertext by extra information to make it a multiple of the symbol size. So you want to make the ciphertext a multiple of the symbol size such that the decryption key that will be appended at the end takes a single symbol to be transmitted. Therefore, you do not have any partial release of the decryption key while it's being transmitted. So you pad the key, you add K, then you apply a second permutation P2. The purpose of the second permutation is defeat interleaving. Before, at the physical layer, you would have the interleaving of whatever message is being passed at the MAC layer. This interleaving will lead to the dispersion of the bits that correspond to your key K to multiple symbols. We try to avoid that. So we apply a permutation P2 that is basically the inverse permutation of the interleaving that is being applied at the physical layer. So this inverse permutation would only affect the keys that the bits that correspond to our key. It will not affect all other bits. So interleaving will be applied to the message normally, except for our last symbol that corresponds to our key. And then after doing all these operations, we pass this message at the physical layer, where you have all the operations of encoding, interleaving, so on and so forth, and that message is being transmitted over the wireless channel. And the property of our method is basically that you have the transmission of the encrypted message first, and then on one symbol you have the transmission of the decryption key. So therefore you're forced to receive the entire message before you receive the decryption key, and once you receive the decryption key, you can actually recover the plaintext. So a little bit more detail on the application of the first permutation. The way we actually apply this permutation is we break a message into multiple fields. Already the different fields, for example, can be the MAC address of the source, the MAC address of the destination, the flags, the payload, so on and so forth. And we distribute all these, the bits from every different field, we distribute them in the reverse order into different plaintext blocks. And then we apply the encryption on these plaintext blocks. What basically this achieves is now bits from every field of the packet that are needed for the classification of the packet are actually dispersed on all plaintext blocks. And then that means that they're also dispersed on all ciphertext blocks. Therefore, I'm forced to receive all ciphertext before I can actually decrypt and reconstruct the entire packet. So now I cannot even conjecture by receiving just a few ciphertext blocks on what the original plaintext is or what are the values of the fields of the original plaintext. So this is one method that we have come up with being able to apply hiding. And one detail that I forgot to mention is that from a security standpoint, we know that the key sizes to provide adequate protection for encryption are typically 128 bits or 256 bits, so on and so forth. For our purposes, we don't really need that long of a key because we only intend to hide a message for a very, very short period of time, as long as the transmission is active. So therefore, you can use a key that is much shorter than 128 bits. You can use a key that is maybe 56 bits, or maybe you can use a key that is much shorter, 48 bits. And basically, the symbol size tells us how long of a key we can use. But if the symbol size becomes too small, then the ciphertext space also becomes very small, and then this solution may not be applicable. For this case, we employ the idea of cryptographic puzzles. So the idea of a cryptographic puzzle is like a puzzle that takes a pre-specified amount of time to be solved. For assume that you have two nodes A and B that are supposed to communicate, then you want to, instead of sending the message in plain text, you actually encrypt that message with a random key, and you send the encrypted message over the wireless medium. Therefore, the adversary cannot classify that message. After the message has been received, you send a puzzle, the solution of which will actually provide you with a decryption key so you can open the original message. So now node B, including the adversary, will have to receive that puzzle, and then he has to spend a pre-specified amount of time to solve that puzzle in order to recover the decryption key. And once the decryption key is being received, then you can actually open the original message and recover the message that is being transmitted. Again, here you can see that this method will actually prevent the selectivity on behalf of the jammer, because he has to first receive the encrypted message, then he has to receive the puzzle, then he has to spend time to solve the puzzle in order to recover the key to open the message. Of course, the trade-off here is that transmission is not as efficient because we have to spend this energy at any receiver, not just the adversary. So everyone now would have to perform this operation in order to be able to recover regular transmission. So there is a trade-off here between the performance and then the resistance to jamming. So this is the cryptographic-based hiding scheme, and it operates exactly as I described. So basically, you generate a random key and you choose the time TP which you want your puzzle to be solvable at. Then you encrypt your plain text with a key and you send it over the wireless medium. And then you also send the puzzle, the solution of which will actually provide you access to the encryption key. And at the receiver side, you first solve the puzzle to recover the key, and then you decrypt the message to recover the original plain text. So we also have a third solution, which is the most efficient out of all, that relies on a cryptographic construction, which is known as all or nothing transformations. This was actually first proposed by Reversed a while back to slow down brute force attacks on symmetric encryption schemes. All or nothing transformations are a publicly known and completely invertible bijective functions. Basically, what you do is you get the original plaintext and you break it down into blocks, and then you apply this bijective function to generate pseudo messages, pseudo blocks. The property of this bijective function is that the pseudo blocks that it generates, all of them are needed in order to recover any part of the original text. So all or nothing transformation means if you have any partial information, that information does not give you anything about the original message. If you have all blocks, then it's straightforward to reconstruct the original message. Examples of this type of transformations are all or nothing transformation based on linear algebra. Basically, you just generate an end-to-end linear system, the solution of which will actually give you the original plaintext. But if you don't have all the blocks, then you don't have enough equations to be able to solve the linear system. That means that all solutions are actually equally probable. So that gives you unconditional security. You also have some other transformations that are known such as the package transform that give you security in the computational sense. So as long as the adversary is computationally bounded, then these solutions are actually valid. So these are the different methods that we have in order to be able to prevent the adversary from applying its selectivity. And we've also evaluated, so here is, for example, the details of the hiding scheme based on all or nothing transformations. You got your original message, you break it down into blocks such that every block is equivalent to one symbol. Then you apply this bijective function to generate the pseudo blocks. Then you transmit the pseudo blocks over the wireless channel. Then every receiver is actually forced to receive all symbols before it can decode, demodulate, recover the original, the pseudo symbols, and then from there recover the original symbols. So fairly straightforward application. So these are the three methods that we have come up with in terms of preventing real-time packet classification on behalf of the jammer. We've also evaluated what is the impact of these methods on the performance of the network. So we performed OpNet simulations on a network of 50 nodes where we actually generated random end-to-end connections between sessions between nodes and transmitted traffic. And basically we applied several techniques for hiding messages. The first one is no hiding at all. The NH corresponds to no hiding whatsoever. The second is MAC layer encryption, just encrypting with a symmetric key. The third method, the CS, corresponds to commitment schemes. The two methods in the middle that have the lowest performance correspond to puzzles. And then the last two methods correspond to all or nothing transformations applying the linear transform and the package transform. And you can see that commitment schemes and all or nothing transformations are the most efficient because basically they only require the transmission of one extra symbol in order to communicate the decryption key at the receiver, while puzzles basically cut the performance almost to half. And this is for the end-to-end throughput, the average end-to-end throughput between any connection that has been established. However, it's not necessary that you actually apply this hiding scheme to any communication that takes place in your network. You can choose, because sometimes it may be expensive, only to apply to different types of operations. So we actually evaluated the communication overhead on the route discovering process. So here is on the x-axis, you still have the different schemes that have been applied, no hiding whatsoever, MAC layer encryption, then you have the commitment scheme, the cryptographic puzzles, and then the last two correspond to the all or nothing transformations. Here we actually measure the time it takes to discover routes when you deploy an on-demand route discovery protocol such as AODV. And because the overhead of that protocol heavily relies on the ring expansion technique that is used to discover routes and flood the information, you see that our methods were not actually the contributing factor to delay. So for this type of protocol, they didn't actually play a significant role. So you can choose depending on what kind of application you consider more important to maybe apply the hiding or not apply the hiding. Okay, so this basically deals with selectivity in terms of messages, but we also can apply selectivity in terms of channels. So you can have a channel selective adversary, for example, that targets your control channel. So in the absence of packet selectivity, he may focus his efforts on one single channel, such as the control channel, which is typically very low rate, and the denial of which can actually lead to denial of service on the entire network. And again, here we have considered this in the presence of an inside adversary. For example, consider you have a communicating group of these nodes, and one of these nodes is compromised, and these nodes are actually using a common pseudo-noise sequence to combat jamming. If that sequence is actually leaked to the adversary, then the adversary can impact any receiver within its communication range. So you can no longer rely on these common secrets to provide protection against jamming. So our idea here is to, since we cannot rely on these secrets, maybe we can force each node to have different PN sequences. So the compromise of one PN sequence may not reveal information about other PN sequences. Of course, this happens at the expense of performance. So we proposed a time-delayed broadcast scheme that implements broadcast as a series of unicast transmissions. So assume that you have 5 nodes, and N1 is the source and wants to broadcast a message to everyone. Instead of doing a single transmission, it will actually start relaying, unicasting the message to each individual node on different frequency bands. So for example, N1 sends the message to N2 on frequency F2, and then N1 sends the message to N3 on frequency F3, so on and so forth, until the message is relayed to every receiver. And of course, the adversary may be successful in denying certain communications, but in the end, if it doesn't know exactly where the communication takes place, he can actually, the broadcast can be completed. And he may be present on multiple channels at the same time. As long as he's not present on all channels, then we should be able to complete this broadcast transmission. So the motivation for this mechanism is, first of all, that concurrent unicasts on multiple frequency bands will actually add redundancy to the system and add jamming resilience. So as long as the jammer can only block a fraction of your frequency bands, then you should be okay. And we also trade delay, obviously, for energy and energy efficiency for jamming resilience. And the difference between this and classical frequency hopping spectrum systems is that each node is assigned a unique PN sequence, and the compromise of that PN sequence does not reveal too much information about the PN sequences of other nodes. Therefore, you cannot completely deny the communication. Other design aspects that we have considered is we also want to be fair and give opportunity to everyone to broadcast, and we also try to minimize delay as much as possible. So the question is, how can we design these hopping sequences? So what we did is we mapped this problem to a graph theoretic problem. So I'll give you some brief definitions from graph theory. Most of you must be already aware. A complete graph is a graph where each pair of vertices is connected by an edge. For example, this is a complete graph of 4 nodes. Then a one factor of that graph is basically a matching, a set of pairwise disjoint edges that cover the set of vertices. And then you have one factorization to be a series of factors such that these one factors span the set of edges. So for example, you can imagine here that you can see this one factorization as sort of a schedule of communication between the different set of nodes. And there's an easy to show theorem that says that every complete graph is one factorable. So if you have a complete graph, you can easily find a one factorization for that graph. So now we mapped the problem of finding the PN sequences for these nodes to the problem of one factorization. So assume that you have a one factor such as the one that is shown in the figure, then the vertices correspond to the nodes I want to communicate, and then the edges correspond to which node is communicate at what slot. So for example here, each one factor is randomly assigned a set of frequencies. So now 1 and 2 are going to communicate on frequency F2, 3 and 4 are going to communicate on frequency F4. Then you generate another one factor that makes other nodes meet and assign different frequencies. And in this way, you actually populate the PN sequences, the hopping sequences of the nodes that communicate. And this particular one factorization, once you have this one factorization, we have two modes of operations. The first one is the sequential unicast mode. This is exactly what I showed you earlier on. So the sender sequentially relays information to every node within this broadcast group. So N1 will relay information to N2, then at the next slot it will meet N3, at the next slot it will meet N4, and then it will meet N5. So that happens sequentially. And obviously, in this kind of scheme, the delay for completing the broadcast is linear with the number of nodes that you have in the group. We also have another several properties of this mode of operation is, for example, this is the schedule, this is a one factorization and a schedule for all the nodes. As you can see, it doesn't matter at what slot your transmission starts. On any given slot within a fixed amount of time, you will have met everyone. Because of the property of one factorization, you can see here, node 1, no matter where he starts, he meets 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 in a sequential manner. There are different frequency, random frequency bands. Therefore, he's guaranteed to meet everyone. And this property is actually preserved for any node. So if I take node 2, node 2 will also meet with everybody else. And it doesn't matter how I shift this in the time domain, this property will always be held. We also have a second mode of operation, which is called assisted broadcast mode. In this mode of operation, what happens is, as soon as you receive a broadcast message, you actually become a relay of that message. So that gives you much faster relay of the overall broadcast message. So here, node N1 will send a message to N2. Now N2 becomes a relay. So in the next time slot, you have N2 and N3 relaying messages to other nodes. And then all four now become relays of the same broadcast message. So you have an exponential increase of the relay nodes. The delay in this kind of scenario now becomes logarithmic with the number of nodes rather than linear. So you have much better performance. And as I will show, we also have much better resilience to jamming. And for constructing these hopping sequences, we introduce this splitting algorithm that basically multiplies the relay set from hop to hop. So initially here, node 1, since if F0 is the one factor we have, node 1 and 2 are supposed to communicate within that slot. On the next slot, these two nodes are split and are set to meet two new nodes. So 1 meets 6, 2 meets 5. Then now these 4 nodes that know that information are getting split again. So now 4 nodes are actually relaying the information. And now you have a relay set of size 4. And this is not only between 1 and 2, but if you start from any pair, this property actually holds. So now any pair, any node can start a broadcast, and this multiplication, this exponentiation property will actually hold. And we've evaluated the resilience of our methods to both external and internal jamming. So here is the performance of our scheme with respect to external jammers, random jammers that hop between different frequency bands and jam the channel under the SU mode. The x-axis here is the jamming probability, which is defined as the fraction of the channels that are being denied by the adversary. The y-axis is the expected delay until a broadcast is completed. And as you can see here, as soon as I get to large fraction of jammed channels, such as 80% of the channels being denied, essentially my delay, given the group size, actually increases to a large amount. However, the key idea here is I can still complete the broadcast. So if I have a scenario where 80% of my channels are denied, this is a pretty strict scenario under which I'm supposed to operate. The AB mode is much better. The number of slots that are needed in order to complete a broadcast is much smaller simply because of this multiplication of relay nodes property. So you can see even if 80% of my channels are being denied, eventually at some point when I break through and I increase my relay set, I will be able to complete the broadcast within a reasonable amount of time slots. So you see in the previous scheme I needed 250 slots to complete the broadcast. In this scheme I'm able to get away with between 35 and 40 slots to complete a broadcast. We also evaluated the resilience under node compromise. So here we have assumed that the jammer has compromised a fixed number of nodes R, which is correspond to the x-axis, and then we have evaluated how many slots are needed until a broadcast is being relayed to every node that is not compromised, and obviously with the increase of the compromised nodes, you have a higher delay, but at some point you can see that my delay starts to drop significantly. And the reason why the delay drops significantly is because when you have, for example, 12 out of the 16 nodes being compromised, you need to relay the message only to 3 nodes. So therefore, the number of nodes that you need to relay the message to becomes very small. That's why you actually get a lower delay. And then this is the graph for the assisted broadcast mode of operation. It has the same trend. However, if you compare the values in the previous case, you needed along the lines of 300 slots to complete the broadcast. In the assisted broadcast mode, this is reduced by 1 order of magnitude. You need about 27, 28 nodes slots to actually complete this broadcast. And then again, you have the same behavior. As long as you compromise many nodes, then fewer nodes need to actually receive that message. That's why you have lower delay. So final remarks: selective jamming attacks in the presence of inside adversaries are a realistic threat. Actually, in WISEC 2011, this particular attack was actually illustrated in a demo. Is actually has been implemented in hardware with fairly simple hardware. I think the authors were just using a USRP platform and were able to actually do selective jamming at the physical layer. The problem requires solutions that span multiple different areas and multiple layers. For example, you need to combine, we showed that you need to combine cryptographic methods with physical layer properties to be able to construct a method that resists this type of selectivity. There are many open problems in the area that you might be interested in working. I did not touch anything about performing packet classification using protocol semantics. I described it, but I did not present any method of preventing this. What if you use a packet size? You can use timing, you can use angle of arrival. There are a lot of other attributes of the wireless communication properties that you can use to classify packets. You also need to support broadcast communication dynamic groups. I just talked about single group that did not change membership. What happens if nodes come in and come out? How do you adjust the hopping sequences such that you preserve the properties of anti-jamming, so on and so forth. Here I have a set of publications for anyone that's interested. I don't know why the display of that is not correct, but in any case, I will leave my presentation with Christina, and then if someone is interested in reading further in this domain, these are some of the references that you can actually refer. And please submit your papers to WISEC 2012. The deadline is coming up in 1 or 2 weeks, and visit us in Tucson, Arizona to have fun. And I'll be happy to receive any questions.
So when you say symbol, what do you mean? What is a symbol to the physical layer?
It's a symbol at the physical layer.
Is that the smallest amount of data that can be sent?
This is the smallest amount of data that is being received when you actually demodulate the symbol, the signal. So the digital signal is modulated to symbols. These symbols correspond to anything between 1 bit, 2 bits, to all the way up to 256 bits. So depending on what kind of modulation, for example, if you have 822.11 at 6 megabits per second, one symbol corresponds to 24 bits. If you go to 54 megabits per second, that may correspond to 256 bits. So this is the least amount of information you need to receive in the analog domain to be able to recover bits in the digital domain.
So it's efficient to keep the key to one symbol size.
But if you keep the key into one symbol, what you buy basically is you do not partially reveal your key at all. So the adversary is forced to receive that symbol, decode that symbol, and then recover the key. No information leakage whatsoever. If you spread your key along multiple symbols, what could happen is that I can start decoding these symbols, and I can partially release your key, therefore reduce your key space. And then I can have a table of this reduced key space. Let's say I have, I've recovered and I'm only missing 8 bits, right? If I'm only missing 8 bits, then there are only that many ciphertext that may correspond to these 8 bits. So that way I can have a lookup table and then be able to perform classification using that lookup table in a very fast way, very short time. And at the same time, I could also preemptively have been corrupting your packet. So maybe I need to just corrupt one more symbol to drop your packet. So if you have some error correction application on your communication, right, and maybe you can afford 10 corrupted symbols, right, I can preemptively corrupt 8 of them or 9 of them and then delay my classification until the end. And then at the end, I can look at the last few symbols, and before you end your transmission, I can theoretically be able to still classify and deny. And of course, that requires a lot of sophistication on behalf of the jammer, but theoretically it's possible.
So also this depends a lot on the transmission time versus the propagation time. Because if the transmission time is really short, then the packet will come out or will be put into the air very quickly. And then is it possible that the adversary could read that and read all the way to the very last, to the key, before it propagates to the next, and then still have a chance to...
Well, again, here it depends on how advanced your adversary is assumed to be. So here what you're saying is you may take into account the topology, right? So topology-wise, if my propagation is such that I'm able to receive and the receiver is far away, and that he's not able to receive because of the propagation delay, I could potentially take advantage of that type of asymmetry. However, in the most wireless scenarios that we are dealing with, for example, ad hoc networks, the range is so short that typically the adversary will not have a significant advantage. It will only gain a few nanoseconds to be able to decode before the actual symbol is actually reaching the destination. Yes?
I want to ask a question. I want to know what's the aim of the jam. I understand the aim is a kind of attack to the wireless network.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know what's the aim of the jam. You know what? Look at your slides.
Which one earlier on?
In the line, you mean attack in the middle of the B and the C.
Okay.
I mean, in the wireless network, because between the B and the C, we have lots of ways. We didn't say only one port, B to C. We from E and F to C.
So you can, okay. So here I think it's maybe an example where it's better.
B to C is a lot of way.
Uh-huh.
In the wireless network, we have a lot of way from B to C. But where you can jam? And what's the aim of the jam?
Okay, so the aim of the jammer is that he can target specific messages, right? So here,
Specific message, you mean the message from B to C?
Yes.
You will interview, we will exchange or drop the messages from B to C.
So specific means,
But B to C, you have a lot of ways to see.
but the adversary could actually overhear multiple messages, right? So you can assume that the adversary is not limited to a single link, right? Imagine that you have an ad hoc network that is being deployed, and I have deployed 10 of these devices close to the center of the network, right? And then
So if you jam at the B to C, as the C will receive the message from other ways.
that is true.
Is it okay?
It is okay, but the question is, maybe I can place 10 of these devices and form a hole in the entire network, right?
Yeah.
So if, depending on how many you have
So
and where you place them,
I'm wondering whether the jam attack can work.
if you
You
can,
have a lot of way to the C. You only jam at the D to the C. The C can receive the real message from another way.
it can, but the question is here, the range of the adversary may not be limited to a single link, right? If you place an adversary in the middle of the network, right, he may be affecting 20 links, right? He may be capable, his range may be capable of overhearing traffic from 20 links. And then if you have 10 of these devices, because they don't cost anything and they only need to be active for a very short period of time and they can live forever, you may deploy 10 of them and then you may be able to affect 200 links. Then that is a significant disruption to the network compared to a single adversary affecting a single link. This is just a simple example.
Why not 10? Right? The way one is
Only the
compromising.
one link.
Here I'm just showing the simplicity of the attack. Like by a single link, I can force you to either discover an insufficient route or even
How you can launch the
So
jam
if I
attack
can-
through all the links? I mean, a lot of
I-
links.
individually, every node is just overhearing what is being transmitted in his surroundings, right? And then I can see if I see a route
Wireless network.
Yeah.
Within the cable, C can receive the message from all the way from a lot of links.
well, not all transmissions are. First of all, not all transmissions are flooding. They don't follow flooding techniques, right? So here, for example, this is.
I mean, not the private.
Can I intervene? So because I think
We can't hear
it's
the
in class.
responses, the questions, we can't hear them.
Yeah, but it's not.
We can discuss it later.
So what I would suggest is if we can take this online, because I know that some of the students actually have a class afterwards as they need to leave, and we can probably take
Sure.
it offline. Are there any other questions? Okay, if not, maybe we can stop there.
All right.